back. So we have two panels this afternoon, one on public discourse and this one on big data. So I'll ask the panelists to come up, and I'm going to introduce the moderator, Rebecca Lemov, who is a professor in the Department of History of Science, and she's also the author of a book called Database of Dreams, which is about using early database technology to try to construct a large database of social, psychological, anthropological data, and is currently working on history of coercive interrogation and brainwashing, which sounds fascinating. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the chance to be here. I've really enjoyed the day so far, and I think our panel now will offer a kind of shift in perspective and also a shift in methodology. So I'll try to frame that. Let's see. So we live in what is sometimes called the petabyte era, and this pronouncement in turn causes much discussion of the sheer size of data that is being produced, as well as the rapidity with which that's happening. And I'm going to make the statistic up, but you hear things like more data is being created in the last 10 years than in all of human history combined, or maybe in the last 10 minutes, we're not quite sure, but certainly it's mounting up. And what is often forgotten, I think, or temporarily put aside in such excited and excitable discussions is how much of this newly created stuff is made of and out of personal data, the almost literal mining, tracking, and harvesting of subjectivity of people's lives, in other words. And I think that point was made earlier by Janet Mock in the keynote discussion, where she said, our phones are extensions of ourselves. We carry ourselves on them. And so this panel, in a sense, looks at what happens when that data circulates and is amassed in large amounts or studied in other ways, and what we can learn when it becomes the topic of social science. And so when introducing the topic of big data, I often start with the 1973 Charlton Heston classic Soylent Green, which is set in the sci-fi dystopian future of 2022, in case any of you haven't seen it recently, in which pollution, overpopulation, depleted resources, dying oceans, and assisted suicide are the norm, and the rations are this stuff called Soylent Green. And of course, the famous tagline, I hope I'm not ruining it for anyone, is that Soylent Green turns out to be people. But you could also argue that big data is people in a perhaps a suggestive way. And today in the press, in the business world, and scholarly journals, the question arises of what is unique about big data. Is it hype? Is it, will the phrase even exist in 5 years? Often definitions of big data are strangely circular, as in this one from the Columbia Journalism Review. Big data is a catch-all label that describes a new way of understanding the world, so which basically boils down to big data is data that is very big. And so, and somewhat in that spirit, I mean, it serves also, I teach a whole class on the history and present and future of big data, so it can be ambiguity and the hype of it actually is quite useful for discussing a range of topics about basically how technology is changing our lives. And in that spirit, that's one of the reasons we have titled this panel Big Data. Many resort to definitions of big data that stress the 3 V's, which are volume, variety, and veracity. And these, in fact, were coined in 2001 by an industry analyst who was trying to describe the problems with big data, not necessarily its revolutionary properties, but they've gone on to become the very definition of big data. Others talk about its transformational properties, and in a bold piece for Wired magazine, the technology evangelist Chris Anderson claimed the end of theory had been reached, and that so much data now exists that it's unnecessary to build a hypothesis to test scientifically, but rather the data can, if you properly handle it, speak for itself. And so I think we have a couple of data scientists and an ethnographer of identity in social media who will speak to some of these questions. But I thought I would start by just reminding us that some of these qualities of big data that are important to keep in mind are precisely where it comes from and its quality of being generated continuously. So if you think about things like the continuous recording of retail purchases, digital devices that record the history of their own use, like mobile phones, or the logging of banking, or clickstream data recording people's navigations through websites or apps, or the way that we do leave a stream in our online interactions of comments, of likes and clicks. For example, in 2012, Walmart was generating more than 2.5 petabytes of data relating to more than 1 million customer transactions every hour. And Facebook reported a couple years ago that it was processing 2.5 billion pieces of content, including language links, comments, and likes, which have now proliferated into those other little icons, per day, so that people upload 300 million photos per day. So today, we have a chance to listen to 3 researchers who are, in a sense, in the trenches with this massive proliferation and trying to figure out what it means for gender in particular. The 3 people we're going to hear, I think it is fair to say, have not taken for granted the personal and gender implications of these new sources of data. And I should add, each is unique in how exactly they approach their subject, but what they have in common is a deep concern with using the unique properties of these burgeoning data sources to study language's formative role in gender identity, both its maintenance and reinforcement and its deconstruction. So we'll see how, gender identity can be both reinforced and perhaps, maintained and also deconstructed. And so our first participant is Ben Hookway. He is the CEO of Relative Insight, which is a UK-based marketing analysis firm. There are longer bios in your program, but just he has a really interesting background, which I just thought I would mention, in law enforcement, pioneering the use of language analysis to identify sexual predators. And more recently, his firm is moving towards marketing. He also has a background in several technology-based businesses, such as Videoactive, Next Device, Critical Path in the UK and the USA. So I'm looking forward to hearing about his work.
So normally I present this to venture capital firms and big brands and marketers and agencies and so on. So it's probably fair to say you're not my normal crowd. But I'm just going to tell you what we do, where we came from, and since we're all about data, I'm going to show you some data as well. So sort of language in America are dear to my heart. I did actually used to live in the States. I'm from Scotland originally. And I moved to the States when I was 24, and at my first ever dinner party, one of the guests asked me, at what age do you start getting taught English in Scottish schools? So I said, well, 8, but I've only just become fluent, which is why I still have an accent. The accent's been kicked out of me somewhat after staying 6 years in the States and doing various things and then going back to the UK. So now I'm CEO of Relative Insight, and Relative Insight is an advanced language analytics business. And essentially what we do is specialize in comparing sets of language. So we do 2 things. We turn this subjective thing, this unstructured thing called language, which people tend to be quite emotive about and have high expectations of, and we turn it into data. But then the second critical thing we do is that we compare sets of data, and we specialize in looking at the differences between sets of language. And this is important because it's the differences which tend to be important, not the language in and of itself. So we're actually originally a collaboration between government agencies in the UK and academia, and we were developed to catch bad people. And one of the examples of catching bad people is online child protection. So in an open chat forum, we can tell if you're a 12-year-old girl or if you're a 30-year-old man doing a very sophisticated impression of a 12-year-old girl. Now, the way we do that is by taking known 12-year-old girl language, taking suspected language, comparing them. And the 2 sets might be 99% identical, But that's not what you're interested in. What you're interested in is the 1% difference that's significant. And unfortunately, if an offender is undertaking that kind of behavior, very often they'll have more than one persona in a chat room. So they manipulate conversations by pretending to be multiple people and trying to direct behavior and so on. And we can detect when that's happening as well. So we do all that good stuff. But we make our money, actually, by using this technology in brands. So we help brands sell you more stuff, because you will respond better to messages if it's in your own vernacular and in the style of language that you tend to use. The trick, though, is how to find out what that language style is if you don't know what you're looking for. And so by comparing two given sets of data, understanding the critical differences, then you can hone in on how different people speak. So it's worth talking about, earlier on in the sessions this morning, there was some discussion about channels of communication, and Twitter was brought up a lot. So we do analyze Twitter, and we do analyze Facebook language a lot. However, we also spend a lot of time analyzing forums and review sites. So when you're looking at language as a data source, you've got to consider the source of the data. And what we find is social, and Twitter especially, although it's easy to get at because it's API accessible and so on, it's very, very volatile. And it's not necessarily a very good medium or long-term reflection of what's really going on in the world. Forums, by contrast, tend to be a lot more thoughtful. There's more room to write. People aren't reacting or retweeting anything. They're giving a considered opinion. So we spend quite a lot of time on there. And we even do things like call center transcripts. We do employee opinion surveys. So rather than having to tick boxes 1 to 5, are you highly satisfied or dissatisfied, you can actually write free-form comments, and this can get analyzed and tracked over time and so on and so on. So when we talk about language, what do we mean? Well, we mean two things, really. The topics people talk about, but also style. So are they emotive? Are they particularly expressive? Are they factual? Are there particular language markers that they tend to use that if you're not in that group, you wouldn't know? So for example, in the UK, one of the big mothers forums is called Mumsnet. And so if you did some analysis on that and you look at the language, you see things like DD, DS, DH coming up all the time. And if you're in marketing, you just kind of ignore these normally, but only by comparing language sets and seeing these things appear as something significant, you realize they're probably pretty important. It turns out they stand for darling husband, darling son, darling daughter, and so on and so on. And this represents the kind of the cultural code of that group of people. So if you're trying to engage with these people and you don't talk like them, you're instantly exposed. A really good example of this was we worked with Microsoft Mobile as well, and they launched a phone which had a great camera in it. Part of the ad campaign was to DSLR enthusiasts, sort of proper photographers. So take this, use this phone and take amazing pictures was kind of the slogan. But if you do a comparison between how DSLR enthusiasts talk and how smartphone review people talk, you find actually that DSLR people don't take pictures. What they do is shoot images. And if you don't know this, you end up with this what we call dad at the disco effect. So most people have probably experienced, and I'm a dad and I've done disco dancing, like you kind of technically they're doing all the right things, but it's just not cool, right? For this kind of unknown reason. And this is and language has the same effect. So that's the kind of stuff we do. This is just who we sell our stuff to. So once you get it in your head that language is nothing but data and the best results come from comparing sets of data, you can compare language across lots of really interesting axes. So two groups of mothers forums in the UK talk about the same topic in very different ways. People will type and express themselves differently on an iPhone, from an iPad, from a desktop. Tracking language over time is fascinating. Everything from how they're talking about your brand before the ad campaign compared with after the ad campaign. The delta tells you the real effect of the ad campaign, not what the ad agency tells you the effect of the ad campaign is. But equally, you can look at, forums have been around so long now that you can go back in time and look at societal change. So we've done projects, for example, on how attitudes to facial cosmetic surgery have changed over the last 8 years. And you can tell this by looking at the language and tracking it. Obviously, different people in different locations, how different brands speak to each other, and so on and so on. But increasingly, we're moving into the world of kind of beyond conventional demographics. This is the other kind of key thing we're doing at the moment. So demographics are kind of a traditional way for marketing people to identify, use a proxy to identify an individual. And they're really kind of out of date. I'm 43 and I live in Manchester in England, and I've got a house and I got a car. It's kind of, so what? People hold multiple personas. I hold multiple personas during the day, in the morning, in the evening, when I'm working, when I'm doing presentations, and so on and so on. And so what we do is model people with a commonality. Either they're all member of a forum, or everyone who follows a particular music artist on Twitter. You can grab all this language together and pull it together, and that's a much better way of targeting people. So that's kind of what we do. And I get to talk about politics because I'm just a bemused observer of your political process at the moment. So, although I was in the States when Bush Jr. got elected, so I've sort of lived through it. But I do have the right, I feel, that because I live in the UK, mock you. So we're going to have a little quiz. What I'm showing you here is candidate A. And this is candidate A's Twitter stream. And this is how they tend to talk on Twitter compared with another candidate, okay? So this is what this candidate tends to over-index on compared to candidate B, okay? So they tend to use social media mentions a lot, personal names, so they name people in their tweets, evaluation, good, judgment of appearance, beautiful, so that's beautiful, awesome, gorgeous, and so on and so on. They're degree boosters, so they're quite expressive, and so on and so on. This doesn't mean the other candidate doesn't use these attributes. It just means that this candidate uses them consistently and statistically significantly more. This is candidate A compared to candidate C. And the green dots are basically the same attributes which keep on appearing. So the point being, it doesn't matter who you compare this candidate with, they have these significant attributes. Who wants to guess who candidate A is? It is Trump. And if you were a marketer and you were looking at this, you'd say, this is great. Personal names, positive. You don't know anything else about their persona, but linguistically, this is a good brand. Candidate D. Same thing. What candidate D says more than candidate E. Oh, sorry, just one more thing. This is Trump against Sanders. That's Trump against Clinton. This is what candidate D says. Same principle. And again, same themes keep coming up. So this particular candidate continually keeps over-indexing on certain things, having to do stuff, discussing conflict, mentioning family, healthcare, gun control, and so on and so on. So guess who this is? That's Clinton. The point is, Hillary Clinton sounds like Hillary Clinton, no matter who you compare it to. Right? You can compare it to Carly Fiorina, and there's no real difference between comparing her to Carly Fiorina or comparing her to Donald Trump. She's continually over-indexing on these things. Point being, from a pure linguistic blind point of view in the presidential race, gender has got no effect at all on the language. So anytime gender comes up, it's because of other societal aspects. There we go. That was all I was going to say. I'm sure we'll get questions about that later, but here we go.
Thanks, that was wonderful. Our next speaker is Lyle Ungar, who's a professor and the graduate group chair of computer and information science at University of Pennsylvania. He also teaches in the psychology department. And he teaches an array of courses from cognitive science to artificial intelligence to machine learning and data mining, crowdsourcing, management of technology, and we're looking forward to, or he was mentioning, developing a course on the singularity, which sounds enticing. So, thanks.
So we heard incredibly powerful personal narratives this morning. This afternoon we're talking about what we can see in aggregate looking at language. I work with a group of psychologists and computer scientists called the World Wellbeing Project, trying to measure well-being of people through the language they use. The theory is that measuring stuff helps to drive change. If you measure GDP, one focuses on GDP. If you can measure well-being, whatever that is, that's a hard question. We can try and define it. So people ask a lot of questions, mostly very ill-formed. Do women talk more than men? But we try in psychology to take these sloppy questions, what does it mean to be nicer or less assertive, make them precise, measure them, and get away from abstract debates to concrete measurement. One concrete example, not my work before we get there, Matthias Bell measured a bunch of men and women, put little recorders, audio recorders on their lapels, counted the words. Who uses more words, men or women? Well, the top 3 talkers in this group were men. The least talkers were mostly men, too. On average, there's not a huge difference. Okay, one could go back and do similar studies in the office place. It is true, by and large, men interrupt women a lot more than women interrupt men, although it's somewhat different for senior female managers, at least in the tech industry where it's been measured. A lot of these things can be measured and quantified. Are you being interrupted? Yeah, if you're female, you are. We don't need to speculate anymore. Cool. So I'm interested not just in these quantitative big pictures. I want to look at the words that people use and understand them. And the wonderful thing for me is that people used to sit around the campfire talking, and I couldn't measure it because I'm a measurement guy. But now they're all tweeting and posting to Facebook and sharing it with me, and I can monitor all their private or semi-private conversations. So what I want to do today is to talk about language and gender, and then language, gender, and personality. Let's see what we can measure. Now, luckily for me, 70,000 people agreed, each individually, to share their Facebook post with me. They said, yes, you may download all the Facebook posts I've made. This is opt-in, not stealing. They declared their gender as male or female. Sorry, this is 2 or 3 years old. This is before the new modern Facebook more choices. So everyone in this group is either declared male or female. Very old-fashioned, I know. We have their age to control for statistically. And they took a very standard personality test. I'll say in a second what the personality things are, but think like extroversion, introversion. Cool. So we can look at what words differ. Now, before I show you these horrible stereotypes, which are just reality, you can like them or not. They're like Trump. They're there. Can't help it, but I can at least measure it and look at it. What I'm going to show you is the words that most differ between men and women. On average, words like the, a, it are used roughly equally, but there are words that differ. So let's see how these words differ. What are the words most indicative of being female? Oh, it's embarrassing. First of all, note for a word, love you is a word, so happy, so with 4 O's, 5 O's, very typical of females. The old guys out there, you know what that little less than 3 means? Yeah, you do. You're not an old guy. Heart. Okay? And you see things like boyfriend and I miss. Very cliche. Sorry. What does it look like to be male? Words most predictive of being male. Oh. I'm a little bit embarrassed since I'm obviously male. Let me say it's not all bad. Males do talk more about engineering and politics. And interestingly, subtle things, males talk more about my wife, whereas females, and these are again averaged over everyone, so this is predominantly heterosexual, Females talk more about husband. They talk about their husbands and other people's husbands too. They're a little more inclusive in their discussion there. Cool. So I'm going to show you a bunch of these. What I've done is cluster together sets of words that tend to co-occur. This is often a little more interpretable. So here's the same set of female words, but you can see topics. And I'll call them topics. The fancy technical term is latent Dirichlet location, but don't worry about it. It's words that show up together. Happy birthday, boyfriends, cute baby, adorable. And similarly for males, I can look at the topics that show up. Okay. Again, I want to point out that males do, on average, talk more about government than females. Okay, so this is what people are distinctively talking about. How accurate is this? So we can take the computer and, given someone's Facebook posts and the words that they use and their self-declared gender, we're 92% accurate. We can also show these same Facebook posts or tweets to human raters and say, is this a man or a woman? What do you think it is? Humans are pretty good at looking at a Facebook post and say, that's a girl, that's a boy. But they make some mistakes. One of the many definitions of stereotype is some mistaken view. I can look at the words that most correlate with incorrect labels of people. So people who are judged to be women but are men are using words like my and love and hair and baby and happy. People who are in fact women but judged as men use words like Ebola, research history, and state. So what's happening? Interestingly, the human raters are picking up on correct statistical trends in the sense that women do talk more about love than men, and men do talk more about research and state than women, but they're overweighting them. They see someone talking about sports or about politics, they go, crap, must be a guy. Wrong. It gives some statistical indication that it might be a guy, but it doesn't mean it must be a guy. So it's interesting to watch at these systematic errors that people make. Cool, I want to shift gears now and talk about personality. We have 70,000 people, these same people who shared their Facebook posts and took a standard 5-factor model, big 5 personality measurement, and we can then look at the words that correlate with each of these 5 factors. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today, starting with extroversion. What do extroverts talk about? And these are controlled for age and sex. So this is as balanced I can get, and it's pretty good. It's partying and getting. I love the can't wait. These guys are in such a hurry they can't even put the apostrophes in with can't, right? This is amazing. So this is fun. I wish I were an extrovert, but most academics, computer science, tend to lower on the introvert side. What do introverts, my colleagues, look like? Well, apart from the angst, there's words like apparently, which are words of more cognitive complexity. There's more reading and drawing, more books, more zombies, I'm not sure. Okay, so that's introversion, extroversion. We're also going to talk today about agreeableness. Agreeable Americans, these are all American samples, talk a lot about religion, actually. Awesome. Disagreeable people. Okay, you're all big, sorry. Should have given a warning, but I assume everyone here is adult and able to deal with these. So rather different words of agreeableness, disagreeableness, introversion, extroversion. We have these for a bunch of these. We can predict your personality about as accurately as your Facebook friends can. So it's not great, but it's a fair amount of signal. But we know for each person whether they say they were a man or a woman. And again, I apologize for the people who don't want to pick either of those categories, but this is, again, old Facebook. This is 2.5 years old. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at a classic circumplex, fancy word again, looking to characterize people on degrees of how assertive they are, how dominant or assertive versus how submissive, the vertical axis, and sometimes called affiliation, connection, agreeable. It's not quite the same as agreeableness, but how much they tie to other people versus don't. So we're going to put people on this piece there, and people sometimes do intermediate versions of combinations of these to say where they fit in the personality scale. But the important thing for us is that we can do this vertical dominance and this horizontal affiliation maps roughly onto the agreeableness extroversion with a slight rotation that I showed you before. So these are correlated but not the same. So extroverts tend to be dominant and a little bit warm. Introverts tend to be the opposite. So we can look from our personality to say something about, I don't know if women are nice or not, but I can see if they're warmer and more agreeable by their language. So we can map lots of topics. We have 2,000 Facebook topics. We can code them with how male in blue or female in yellow they are, where they fit in this piece there. We can look at all the words, which we don't have time to look through. But I want to show you 2 dimensions of this in some detail. So along the bottom axis, which is a little hard to read, is male to female. On the vertical axis is hostile to warm, degree of affiliation. And every dot is a word topic. I've shown a few of those. I hope they can be seen. So you can see, for example, on the bottom left, all those squaring are hostile males. Up in the right, shopping, Christmas, grocery, are warm females, but that's not particularly, shopping is not particularly an affiliative binding thing. Up top, family, friends, wonderful, blessed, amazing, strong affiliation, strong female. And we can see, in general, women do talk, and I think they actually believe, with more connection on average. And again, I have to emphasize, everyone is different. It's like talking more, talking less. This is averaged over 70,000 people. But in terms of characterizing a broader American population, you can see that women on average do seem much more connective. Make sense? The other dimension that's, and this is not a surprise psychology, that's been disputed more is assertiveness. The positive version, dominance, maybe less positive. Where do men and women sit in terms of how much they tend to be assertive or not? And there the connection is much weaker. What we find again on the bottom, males on the left, females on the right, and assertiveness, there's a slight, it's statistically significant, but not very big, where actually we find women slightly more assertive than men. Now, again, one has to say this is on Facebook, maybe different in the office. I'd love to have lots of recordings of office conversations. Some of the companies I talk to are starting to do this and analyze those discussions. But you can see, again, these sort of systematic differences where very male and very non-assertive is computers programming Photoshop. Very male and very assertive is, again, swearing. But sort of in the middle, this happy birthday wishing sister, quite gender neutral. So we don't have time to look at all of these. If you go to www.p.org, our website, you can go and play with these and look at the different versions. It's all up there to play with. But lots of insight to mull over what our people are talking and how are they talking about it. So what have we seen? Well, first of all, there is systematic differences between males and females and how they post on Facebook, not surprising, and systematic errors that people make in overweighting, for example, how likely someone discussing sports is to be male. We've seen that words show personality. The marketers love that. But I love that also in the sense that I want to go and customize hospital treatments. If you're more conscientious or less conscientious, you should probably be getting different instructions, do things there. We've seen that assertiveness is often misjudged. I haven't given you the literature on this, but a lot of controversy. But I think there's often a fair amount of assertiveness going by women, and if you can quantify it, you get a better idea of what's happening or not happening. More broadly, I'm in the business of building tools for measuring things, and I'm in the business of selling. I don't do it for money, give away for free, all open source. I'm in the business of selling these tools to help other researchers do them. Again, I want to stress for free. It's relatively cheap and easy. I haven't talked to you. I've got 10 billion tweets, which I can map to US County and look at variations in personality, in inequality, in racism across county level piece, so at communities. It's a way to get at what people are thinking and feeling as they talk to their friends or post their blogs or the discussion boards. I want to end by noting that what we've done here is very basic, male or female. We're now looking at gender spectrum. People aren't either talking male or talking female. Everyone sits somewhere on a spectrum, and maybe it's even 2 dimensions. There's a degree of maleness and a degree of femaleness to people's language, which is something we can explore when we have these really large data sets. we can try to understand eventually, I hope, across very different subgroups of self-definition, how their language varies. So I think it's going to be a great time going forward to get a picture in the very large scale of what life looks like within people's very small worlds. And that I thank you.
Thanks. That was a really rich talk, and we'll look forward to some questions. But first we have Alice Marwick, who is a social media researcher based in New York City. She's the director of the McGannon Center for Communication Research and an assistant professor at Fordham University's Department of Communication and Media Studies. Her first book, Status Update, Celebrity, Publicity, and Branding in the Social Media Age, came out with Yale a couple of years ago and is a really fascinating ethnography of how people in the San Francisco tech scene use social media to boost their status and popularity and how this affects their offline lives. And her current research has moved more towards the proliferation of sexism and misogynistic speech online, using such topics as Gamergate and the Reddit and Donglegate Reddit controversies and online harassment as places where she's looking. So I look forward to this.
All right. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to be at such an interdisciplinary event. I think that when we're tackling these large, weighty topics like language and gender, it's great to see people from across the spectrum addressing them. I'm an ethnographer, and so I deal in what we might call small data, interviews and observations, which often can help us to contextualize and problematize the findings of big data. For the last 3 years, I've been thinking a lot about online sexism, and today I'm going to give a short overview of the visibility of online sexism, particularly with regard to language, and discuss the implications. Social media like Twitter, Reddit, and forums enable collective action and participation, but they also enable a new type of organized, gamified harassment that works to shut down the voices of women, queer people, and people of color online. And I would like to give a little bit of a trigger warning that there is some very sexist speech in this presentation, and I think it's important to present it so you can see the magnitude of what we're dealing with online. So Zoe Quinn is a software developer who became the target of an organized brigade after her ex-boyfriend wrote a 10,000-word screed about her on his blog. He claimed that she had lied to him, that she cheated on him with 5 guys, and most damagingly, he claimed that Quinn had slept with a writer for Kotaku, a video game blog, to get favorable coverage for her game Depression Quest. This was unequivocally proven to be false, but under the pretense that they were trying to reform ethics in video game journalism, a group of gamers organizing through websites and chat rooms inundated Ms. Quinn with thousands of hateful messages. They distributed nude photos of her, and her address and social security number were revealed. And this is a process called doxing, where people's personal information is revealed online for the purpose of sort of shaming and harassing. People called her parents. They called her phone at all hours of the night. They openly discussed raping her, her weight, and the smell of her vagina. This brigade unified around the Twitter hashtag Gamergate. As the harassment escalated, Anita Sarkeesian, a feminist media critic and favorite target of anti-feminist gamers for several years, was also doxxed and forced to cancel an appearance at the University of Utah due to a death threat. Another game developer, Brianna Wu, posted anti-Gamergate memes on Tumblr and Twitter and also received death threats. An actress, Felicia Day, a longtime gaming advocate, wrote an emotional blog post about the effects that Gamergate was having on her ability to trust male gamers, and she was promptly doxxed for her trouble. But Gamergate is only the latest kerfluffle in a series of well-documented and often high-profile incidents in which women have been openly harassed, stalked, or otherwise systemically targeted online for political and feminist speech, for criticizing the video game or technology industry, or just for existing. These high-profile cases are the most extreme of a general atmosphere of sexist speech, gendered harassment, and misogynistic comments in many places online. Moreover, and what I think is most interesting about this, is that these brigades are organized. Sarkeesian refers to these groups as cyber mobs. They're collectives which engage in cooperative competition to increase the harm to their victims. They reinforce their social dominance over marginalized groups. And what this means is that people use social media to work together, to learn personal information about their targets. They gain status in their community as they escalate the harassment. And in this way, online harassment becomes a game. Those of us who have ever read YouTube comments, or waded into forums like 4chan, or even some parts of Reddit, have seen sexist terms, jokes like women should be in the kitchen, or make me a sandwich, or men simply calling women fat, ugly, and slutty, the triumvirate of uncreative but expected gendered insults. Now, of course, this is not restricted to sexism. The comment sections of blogs and websites are often rife with racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and just plain mean and profane language. The harassment of women of color and queer women is often compounded by intersectionality. When I appeared on television to talk about online sexism, the channel posted the video on YouTube, and the comments on the channel were terrible. So I posted my favorite comment: "I respect women, but I hate feminists. I believe that feminists should be gang raped." And Helen Lewis, a British journalist, posted what she calls Lewis's Law: the comments on any article about feminism justify feminism. And unfortunately, Lewis's Law has proven to be very much true in my own experience. Women in certain online spaces frequently find themselves the subject of attacks that use sexual violence and gendered speech acts as intimidation. I've heard about this from political writers, economists, feminist bloggers, technologists, music writers, and journalists. One friend moved her family to a different city after she was stalked based on her feminist writing. The blog Feministing had a dedicated FBI agent to deal with death threats. And a science blogger I know has been stalked for 9 years by someone who follows her on every social media platform. And as Laurie Penny, a financial writer for The Independent, wrote, "An opinion, it seems, is the short skirt of the internet. Having one and flaunting it is somehow asking an amorphous mass of almost entirely male keyboard bashers to tell you how they'd like to rape, kill, and urinate on you." So you might ask, don't both genders deal with harassment and meanness online? And yes, this is definitely true. And as you can see in this graph from the Pew Research Center, which is a nonprofit that researches online behavior, both men and women experience online harassment, meanness, and cruelty. But two interesting things. First of all, you can see that the rates are much higher for younger people. And this only looks at people 18 and over. And so the youngest groups of people are the ones who are experiencing the most harassment. And if we had numbers for like 13 to 18-year-olds, we might also see that they're experiencing large amounts of harassment. And the other thing I think that's interesting about this graph is if you look at the number of men versus women who are being stalked or physically or sexually harassed, or that the harassment is sustained, it's greater for women than for men. But besides harassment, the normalization of misogynistic language online is something that I'm also following and that I'm concerned about. And scholars have pointed to the emergence of a manosphere as a central contributor to the spread of online sexism. And the manosphere, this is the men's rights subreddit. So Reddit is a forum, a discussion forum, and it has a lot of subsections, and each subreddit is dedicated to a different topic, and this one is dedicated to men's rights. And the manosphere consists of websites and message boards where men discuss men's rights, pickup artist techniques, the feminist agenda, and in more extreme cases, bond over misogynistic ideals. And the Southern Poverty Law Center characterizes the manosphere as, quote, an underworld of so-called men's rights groups and individuals on the internet, which is just fraught with really hardline anti-women misogyny. Now, the manosphere, to a certain extent, is diverse. It's spread across different websites and technologies, from mainstream sites like Reddit and Hacker News to more obscure corners of the internet. But these separate subcultures are homophilous. In other words, birds of a feather flock together. When people with similar views spend most of their time interacting with other people with the same views, a polarizing effect happens in that their views tend to become more extreme. Thus, the development of these male-centric communities may encourage sexist speech and allow men to work together to systematically devalue women's contributions or even harass women. And I want to make a note on demographics. The title of this talk, No Girls on the Internet, refers to a maxim that's thrown around on male-centric sites like Reddit or in gamer groups. Oh, there's no women on the internet. Every woman you meet on the internet is just a guy pretending to be a woman. But actually, we see in the United States that about 86% of both men and women are on the internet. There's a gap in access in terms of class and education, but there is not one in terms of gender. But we also know that most social media users are women. About 60% of Facebook users are women. Most Twitter users are women. The same with Flickr, Tumblr, Instagram, and Pinterest. On the other hand, LinkedIn, 4chan, and Reddit are primarily used by men. Now, there may be a participation gap. 87% of Wikipedia contributors are male. Male students are more likely than female students to create, edit, and distribute digital video over YouTube or Facebook. But this doesn't hold true for content creation over Tumblr or Instagram. So if there are plenty of girls and women on the internet, but they may not be hanging out in the same spaces as men, this homophily may be compounded by a relative absence of female contributions in some spaces. And this combines with what we really see as an emerging troll culture on spaces like 4chan, in which extreme racist, sexist, homophobic, and ableist insults are used to insult people, to shock them, and to produce a certain type of affect in the people that these insults are aimed at. Now, what this means is that egregiously sexist slurs online are becoming normalized, and this is especially true for young people. This is a graphic that I love. That's MRA stands for Men's Rights Activist and surrounded by misandry. And much of the manosphere's supporters are speaking about sexism and gender extensively, but in a bizarro world way. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that the patriarchy hurts men just as much as it does women, and I think that men should talk about masculinity and changes in masculinity and things like that. But that's not what's going on in these spaces. Let me give you an example from another subreddit, which is called the Red Pill, which is a pickup artist community. And the Red Pill summarizes itself as, quote, discussion of sexual strategy in a culture increasingly lacking a positive identity for men. And it refers to the moment in the sci-fi movie The Matrix where the protagonist Neo takes the red pill and has his eyes open to the dystopian reality of his world, what 1970s feminists would call consciousness raising and what people today say means to be a woke person. To red pillers, the red pill reveals the reality of a world where the deck is stacked against men and feminized behavior is rewarded. And I could spend the rest of this lecture just talking about the red pill, but let me give you an example of one of their theories. Women are very emotional, and most women make their decisions based on their emotional state at the time. The rationalization hamster is an analogy for the thought processes used by women to turn bad behavior and bad decisions into acceptable ones to herself and her friends. When a woman makes a bad decision, the hamster spins in its wheel, the woman's thinking, and creates some type of acceptable reason for that bad decision. The crazier decision, the faster the hamster must spin in order to successfully rationalize away the insanity. So that's the type of deep thinking about gender and sexism that is going on in these spaces. Now, subreddits like the Red Pill and groups like Men's Rights Activists do not agree on everything, but they do share a common language. They have been highly successful in popularizing their own vocabulary, including terms like misandry, their word for feminism, the male equivalent of misogyny, defined as dislike for, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against men, white knighting, which is men who espouse feminist views or speak up for women, and the idea is that they're only doing so in order to appear heroic and appeal to women, and social justice warriors, which is a pejorative term for anyone who engages in feminist, anti-racist, or pro-queer activism or discourse, and they often co-opt activist and social justice rhetoric. So not only do we have an increase in sexist slurs, we have an increase in these rhetorical moves to discuss feminism using intrinsically anti-feminist words like misandry. And you'll see this throughout the internet in a wide variety of spaces, from Twitter to comments on tech blogs to places like Facebook. And this graph is from Google Analytics, and it shows how misandry basically came out of nowhere before 2007 and has gradually increased in popularity in terms of people Googling for it, talking about it, and speaking about it. So I want to talk about a couple of implications in my last few minutes. First, I want to think about the idea that internet culture encourages participation and creativity. Websites like 4chan or the Men's Rights subreddit are generative communities of online participation and activism. In many ways, they are what we might call social movements or communities of practice. They often resemble organized fandom in their desire to learn everything about and obsess over their targets, but they are anti-fans in that they hate and despise their subjects. And I think we need to stop categorizing creative participation as, by definition, a positive thing. The second implication is the chilling effects of harassment. Kathy Sierra, a prominent tech blogger who wrote about user experience, hardly a controversial topic, was so badly harassed that she stopped blogging and stepped away from her former career as a public speaker and visible tech expert. She was discouraged from earning a living due to online harassment. Now, this is very understandable given how scary and problematic harassment can be, but it also compounds the problem. If women stop voicing opinions in traditionally male realms like economics, politics, and technology, the women who do so will continue to be seen as outliers. But I think that what is more likely is that rather than stopping participating, women will move to the more female-friendly parts of the internet. Now, there's nothing wrong with fashion blogging, mommy blogging, or Pinterest, but they tend to focus on very traditional views of women and have a somewhat conservative norms of femininity, looking pretty, being a great cook, or making your own baby food. I interviewed fashion bloggers during my postdoc, and what they all said to me is that the norms of their community was that you must be nice online, that you couldn't openly criticize other people. So this means that the safe corners of the internet may box women into expressing themselves through very traditional, almost stereotypically feminine ways. And as we all know, women have plenty to offer the world that is not about fashion, cooking, parenting, or homemaking. It should not be the case that the only way women can reliably avoid online harassment is to adhere to stereotypical gender roles. But I worry that that's where these instances are heading. So let's think about solutions. Gendered harassment and online sexism is a very complicated problem. It goes far beyond Gamergate or even the technology industry itself. But unfortunately, there is as of yet no good legal or policy solution. Internet harassment is difficult to combat through legal means. There are issues of jurisdiction and, most importantly, free speech. The police are often unsympathetic or do not understand the technical issues. They often tell victims to simply stay off the internet. Moderation is very expensive. Companies like Twitter are finally beginning to build tools in to combat harassment, but they have been slow to adopt proactive solutions. And I will say that as companies build in things like being able to flag posts or being able to turn people in for various violations, those are frequently used against women, against feminists, against queer people as a form of harassment by these sort of brigades. Every day, new online communities and apps are launched with the assumptions that their users will be good actors without any protection for those who may be harassed. Online sexism, however, is not something that we merely have to tolerate. There are already many women organizing themselves to combat it on blogs, Tumblr, Twitter, and Reddit, whether by technical means or support networks. If you are the victim of harassment or sexist speech, I urge you to seek out social support from other people going through similar things. And I also urge everyone in this room to speak out against sexist language when you see it online, with the goal of, if not eliminating online harassment and sexism, making it less common, acceptable, and part of the everyday. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent contribution. And now we're going to have about 15 or 20 minutes of discussion among the panel, and maybe we can talk about the differences in their approaches and aims for their research. And then we'll have time for some questions from the audience, and we'll set up a mic shortly. So, yeah, I was really struck by some commonalities among these presentations in the sense that there's a kind of overwhelming feeling that a lot of data produced from the online world, from the sources that you've all worked with, tends to retrench or reinforce pre-existing stereotypes and norms, much as, despite the sort of rhetoric we often hear about disruption, revolution, new forms arising. And so I wonder if you could each comment on that kind of maybe paradox.
I think it goes both directions. So on the one hand, there's this huge weight of reinforcement of common things because people form these homophilic groups and do things. On the other hand, we haven't talked about social change. Mm-hmm. And one thing we've been looking at is tracking, for example, changes in domestic partner violence discussion, which has changed. The names behind it has changed many times in the last decade. You can see the use of mainstream events that are reported in the mainstream media being picked up by social media and in turn driving policy. You can see this tremendous groundswell of organizing. So I think that on the one hand, there's this reinforcement. On the other hand, it is a great medium for social activism, and you can actually see public policy starting to be affected more at the local level. It's harder at the national level to have this effect, but I live in Philadelphia, reasonably big city, and it's still a case that organizers can get enough of a groundswell to influence public policy.
So perhaps there's some backlash, but also evidence of
also organizing and people mobilizing.
Yeah, I think that it depends which way you cut the data. Comparing your assessment of how women tend to talk online compared with men on Facebook. Yeah. Interestingly, we ran something recently. It's very, very unusual for a client of ours to ask for a gender split. That almost never happens, which is a good thing. You know, they're more interested in the persona in general of people. But we were asked to compare self-validated Twitter, successful people on Twitter. So this is normally people who, in their bio on Twitter, describe themselves as successful, and then split it male-female. And women talk about politics and issues more than men in that group. So, and on the whole, actually, women use more pronouns. They're more conversational, and so on and so on. So, on the whole, I think men still kind of resort to numbers and sport and all this kind of stuff. That's generally true. But I think when you split away from just sort of the straight male-female split, and you split and compare things in other ways, then I think other sort of truths reveal themselves.
One of the things I think is most interesting about social media is that it's used by a very wide, diverse group of people with a lot of different opinions. And often this means that conversations that have been going on for years among different groups and communities get bubbled up, and other people can see those who aren't necessarily part or don't understand the context of this conversation. I think this speaks to what Janet Mock was saying in her keynote about the title of her memoir. What we see on Twitter especially is that often there'll be a group like, say, young African Americans talking about something with a particular hashtag, and that becomes visible to other groups who don't necessarily understand the context of that. And then you can get this kind of harsh, quick backlash against it. Like, you'll see people making a bunch of racist comments because a conversation is visible to them that has always gone on, but they have not been able to see it until social media has made that visible. And so I think that when we're looking at how social media both contributes to reinforcing and resisting these norms, I think we can see that a lot of social activism, as Lyle said, has gone on through social media. I mean, you just have to look at the Black Lives Matter hashtag. You have to look at the sort of contemporary moment in popular culture around feminism, which is something that for like a decade there was lots of feminist stuff going on, but it really hadn't made it into the mainstream and into pop culture. And I think a lot of that has been due to the work of young feminists on different platforms doing that work, and then that work being able to disseminate into the mainstream as well. So for all of my sort of terrifying rhetoric in my talk about how terrible these clashes are, I think that there's something quite empowering, especially for young people, to be able to have these conversations and have them impact the mainstream in a way that wasn't possible before they had access to social media technologies and other ways of sort of broadcasting their thoughts to a larger audience.
Yeah, I think what strikes me is that there's a kind of dynamic of this rapid emergence of proliferation of voices, just as I love the comment in our keynote, we can now broadcast our lives, and this idea of multi-layering, the idea of the proliferation of genders, and even the way they're obviously reflected in Facebook. So, but at the same time, there's a kind of retrenchment and fear that gets triggered by these kinds of things, and so you see other forces arising, and so this reinforces, I guess, the idea that this is a very rich area for research. And I wondered what you all think are the advantages and disadvantages of the methods you've chosen. I mean, Lyle and Ben you work largely with quantitative methods, and Alice with qualitative, and I wondered if you could comment on I guess, the advantages and disadvantages of each.
We do actually both qualitative and quantitative. I think the key thing is the amount of data you can collect. I don't care what the number, but just get a flavor of different subgroups. What are they talking about when? What language are they using? What do they care about? To go out and run interviews, really expensive. To do telephone calls, surveys. Gallup recently finished their millionth survey. I have 10 billion tweets. I can't afford the budget of Gallup, but I can run more questionnaires than they can. I can look at changes at a finer spatial and temporal resolution than they can. The world is changing from a research standpoint, be able to pinpoint, look what's happening in Cambridge versus Boston over this debate. And I think this level of exposure is, in fact, tremendously powerful.
Yeah, I think we have a sort of similar view in that until comparatively recently, you had the choice between quant, that is sort of number-driven stuff, but in language on the internet, that basically gave you something like sentiment analysis. So is it 34% positive? Or, it's kind of, A, it's not particularly accurate, and B, it's even if it was really accurate, what does that even mean? Whereas, of course, the other way is with qual, you get a lot of nuance, a lot of complex answers and drilling in, but of course, you get to ask 20 people in a focus group who never tell you the truth anyway, because you're asking them the question, so you bias the answer. So we are getting to the point now where you can get qual-type insights at quant scale. From our perspective, doing comparisons is always the key thing. The hard bit is always, what comparisons do you want to run? Because there's so much to compare and so much to draw out. It's almost too powerful a technique.
Yeah. As somebody who mostly does, as I said, small data work, in that I interview people, I often spend large amounts of time in the communities that I'm studying. I spend a lot of time talking to people and trying to understand how they make meaning of their world and their lives. I think one of the most important issues in data analysis right now is that of ethics. Just because you can collect and look at something doesn't mean that you should collect and look at it. And a lot of colleagues, well, not a lot, there's been several cases in my field in which, say, somebody was doing an ethnography of like Tumblr feminists or something, and one of their research subjects posts a Tumblr post saying, you know, researchers are not welcome here, I don't want you looking at my stuff, this is not for you, this is not your space. And we see lots of indicators by which people are trying to target their online communication to a particular audience, right? They're using particular linguistic codes, they're marking their speech in some way, saying it's for a particular peer group. And I have another whole research area on online privacy, which is one of my other main research areas. And what we see is that people often, even if they know that someone can see something that they post on Facebook or Twitter or whatnot, they assume that people will know what audience it's for based on the language that they use. And the problem with big data research methods is that that's all lost, right? That it all gets scooped up and analyzed, and there's no IRB, Institutional Review Board review usually needed for big data, whereas...
No, everything we do is IRB.
Oh, everything is
I have
IRB?
A full-time person doing IRBs. Every person who shares their Facebook consents both to me, something approved by IRB.
No, your work 100%, right? Like you said, you have
Everything is
7.
IRB, and I can't say how much time I spend making sure that everybody signs off.
All right,
which is good.
I'm sorry. I was not meaning to single the two gentlemen
I know
to
I
the
sound
right
defensive,
of me.
but it's a lot of it's
But
very important.
There's a lot of conferences where people are presenting work that is not as rigorous as Lyle's in terms of the data collection.
And most companies don't have IRB.
Most companies don't have IRB.
Much worse problem.
And one of the things that we see that's also problematic is that companies like Facebook have enormous internal research departments, and they don't publish a lot of their research, and we don't know what they're doing, and we don't know what kind of experiments they're doing on Facebook users. So first of all, academics in general are sort of at a disadvantage when it comes to like big social media organizations, and second of all, there's this sense that there are bodies of researchers who aren't doing that kind of ethical work that I'm doing, that Lyle is doing, that other researchers around the country are doing. So I think these are some of just the general ethical questions that are brought up in the age of big data, and I think we're going to be working those out in our various subfields for years to come. They're very hot topics right now.
Yeah, just from my experience teaching this class on big data, and it's, a couple of the greatest areas of the growth of the use of big data are in predictive policing, so used by police forces to target certain areas where crimes may occur based on patterns and data, and then send more police there, or patrol differently, or interview people they believe at the age of 17 may commit a crime when they're 19, or things like that. That used to be reserved for dystopian fiction, are actually programs in at least 5 cities already underway. And also, as Alice indicated, there's quite an unregulated use of data. I mean, when you sign your user agreement with Facebook, I believe you agree to basically to become an experimental subject. And it's interesting when you look at the Facebook experiment that came out about 2 years ago, which was published in a high impact journal. This caused a huge uproar. That it turned out this was quite a simple experiment where it was shown that with something like, 33 million, many users, if you change their feed, the news feed, if you sort of move it towards more positive stories, people would then start to make more positive comments in their feed, and there was also a negative result, so you could apparently emotionally engineer the Facebook audience. And this caused an outcry, but in fact, these type of small changes are being tested all the time. It was more the fact that it became public. So there's actually an increasing divide, perhaps, between the academic world and the commercial world, where both, or perhaps between data-driven science and big data. So these are all areas that are, you know, a lot going on, I guess we could say. One theme that I thought was interesting that came out in all of your presentations was, or I would be interested in hearing your comments on this, was that there were changes among younger users or in the data that you got from younger people, or else, as Alice said, that younger people seem to experience greater levels of harassment. And I would imagine that maybe also, or maybe you could comment on this, was the language that younger people using showing up as different?
Yeah, I didn't show it. We can tell within 5 years someone's age from their Facebook language. Extremely straightforward. Some of them are use of things like pronouns or the, which old people say the, putting spaces after periods, but down to fine-grained versions. People keep talking about LOL here with the two ones, but in fact, the current LOL is mostly League of Legends.
No.
Oh, really?
You old people are still laughing out loud from like the 90s, was that? So there's huge changes happening, and several people have alluded to, but there's lots of in-group signaling, and it really is the case that it's called you ship people. It's a verb, not a noun. These things have shifted massively in the last couple of years, and you can see them stratified. The 14-year-olds and the 16-year-olds look really different. Also, they're shifting in terms of moving away from old, slow platforms like Twitter to Snapchat, Instagram, much more communication with images, with small amounts of text attached. You old people still type words. That's very retro. I'm in favor of it. I'm a word guy. I use words too, but the whole notion of how communication occurs, visual, streaming, instant, if you missed it, you'll get something else the next hour. Why are you going to store and look at yesterday's email? I mean, that's so antique. So I think the style of communication is changing even more than the content. And I think it's something to look at the notion of how does communication occur? How does bonding occur? I'm old enough to remember people talking on telephones to each other, very quaint, slow communication, not texting in the middle of the conference to see what you just saw.
Yeah, so maybe just comments from Ben and Alice,
Yeah.
and then we'll have some questions.
I actually had to explain to my 9-year-old son last week why it's called wireless. I think, by the way, David Cameron's thought it was lots of love as well, our Prime Minister. That shows how in touch the UK is with the modern times. I think, I don't know about platforms, but we've certainly seen significant differences between the way younger age groups discuss a given topic compared with olders. And there's sort of unifying themes. So like we did this for a handset manufacturer, and if you look at the reviews of mobile phone handsets by age group, there's the younger you are, the more expressive you tend to be. So it's beautiful, gorgeous, awesome, sleek, that kind of stuff. Younger people talk a lot more about the quality of the camera being important. They talk a lot more about the battery life being important. But my favorite, I think, is overuse of the word definitely. Because you only know everything when you're young. And your opinions are far more polarized the younger you are, right? And so it's beautiful, gorgeous, fantastic, and I definitely recommend it. And I won't go into what old people talk about. That's too embarrassing. But yeah, there are definitely big differences.
That's interesting.
I want to echo Lyle's comments about platforms like Snapchat. And one of the projects I'm working on right now is on privacy and socioeconomic status, and we're interviewing 16 to 26-year-olds. And one of the things that I find so interesting about like the 16, 17, 18-year-olds is that within every high school, there are often sort of apps that, well, first of all, apps and mobile devices, they're very trendy, right? So the kids will all use like an app for a specific amount of time, and then they'll move on to another app. And often that is very localized within like a group of friends or a high school, and kids will share the same media ideologies around a particular communication platform, and then they'll move on to something else, usually once their parents discover that it exists. So it's not even solely generational. Communication is extraordinarily contextual in every single way, that it differs by age, by community, by class position, by access, whether you're mostly accessing the internet on your phone or whether you have access to a laptop or not. All of these things are quite different. And so this is one of the nice things, again, about qualitative work, is that you can kind of drill down into these very particular ways, and rather than trying to make generalizations, you can really understand how communication technologies, how they affect young people's sense of identity expression and their relationships with other people. And what we find is these effects are often quite profound.
Thank you. So we'd love to take some questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm a graduate student in psychology, and I just want to put the disclaimer that I'm heavily entrenched in qualitative research, so that's a big bias. But I'm currently involved in a study. We use personal narratives of HIV-positive women, ethnic minority. And if one were to look at their language among these 100-something narratives, it would look really similar. They're all from pretty much the same socioeconomic status, right outside of Chicago, around the same age. So, but what we find is when we look at these narratives, there are just vast amounts of nuance, like you were speaking to. And we've used this data, it's longitudinal, so we've used a lot of this to look at coping styles in women and viral loads, and it has affected policy change on a really effective level. So I guess, and that's a little bit of a tangent, but I guess I just see this really big danger in clumping this together in almost like an essentialist notion, and I see some possibility of it moving social justice movements backwards, like things that, and this may be a knee-jerk reaction to seeing women being associated with using the word shopping so much. But when you're just looking at their language and you're not getting their backstory, you're not getting the demographics, you're not getting the nuance, it would be easy to come up with essentialist notions of what this is looking like. So I guess I'm just wondering, how do you keep this from going toward, how do you keep it from moving us backwards in the feminist movement, the queer movement, so on?
Well, I think the big data does offer a huge benefit, which I did not talk about today, in actually splitting rather than lumping. So it is the case, I look at our 20-something-year-old poorer African-American, they use Twitter really different than 50-year-old, well, whites, men or women who are more professional, or blacks of that age. There's huge differences. The thing is, we can actually look at detailed narratives of people from Camden, New Jersey, different parts of Philadelphia. We do collect actually narratives. People volunteer and write essays and share them with us. So I think it really is important to contextualize, and I apologize if I oversimplified, really different to look at work discussions, family discussions, peer discussions. So I think different platforms, all these things can be done. It's really easy to just average, and what do you get? You get straight, you get middle-aged, because that's the average, you get white, because that's the majority. So sure, if you don't split stuff, then you obscure all the variation. The nice thing is, certainly if you're a Facebook or that size, you can split it as finely as you want and look at the really micro communities and variations. You can get the backstory. We're now taking people and getting them to share their entire medical history and their full Facebook history. We know their age, their sex, we know what sort of insurance they have. We know a lot about these people, again, with their informed consent, and can go back. Look, so I think it's a real danger that it's easy to be facile and say, oh yeah, girls say shopping. That's nice, but that's not true of all girls, and not all of them are girls, right? So
I think I'm thinking of a couple of examples where much of this is about how you apply and think through what you're trying to communicate and who you're trying to communicate it to, and where the potential for miscommunication lies. So there's a medical example where we've done work with some pharmaceutical companies. And if you think about the journey from the pharma company to the patient getting a benefit, the way the pharma company talks about a condition compared with how doctors talk about the same condition, compared with how patients talk about the same condition, subtly shifts to the point where this word that the patient uses, they're meaning the same thing as the pharma company, but it all gets kind of lost in translation. And we've had some reasonably interesting and successful results where somebody has modified their style of communication for the person they're trying to target, and it's had very positive results.
I just want to add to that that on social media, a lot of the language that we see is quite performative in that people are often attempting to manage the impression that they're making on other people. So they're using affiliative language practices in order to either, the woman who constantly is talking about cute dogs and shopping, that might be, like, I talk about cute dogs on Twitter, like, quite a bit, I might add. But she might also be trying to affiliate herself in certain ways or trying to perform a particular type of femme identity for a particular end, right? And I think that when we're thinking about the visible identity cues that people are making on social media, we also have to think about the fact that many people see social media as somewhere where they have a particular persona that they're furthering. And one of the other things that I'm interested in is how a lot of the time those personas get branded, that people start thinking of themselves as using advertising and marketing strategies and using social media and reaching out to others. And I think that that's the kind of thing that the kind of qualitative work that you're doing, that Lyle is talking about, that can really sort of add to our understanding of those types of social media linguistic practices.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Kira. I'm from Connecticut College. I'm a sophomore there, and I'm curious, this question's for Alice. What's your opinion on Yik Yak?
Oh, so those of you who don't know, Yik Yak is a mobile app. It is sort of like anonymous Twitter, that you can say things anonymously and it can get up or down voted by the rest of your community. And it's geolocated, meaning that generally you're seeing Yik Yaks from people around you. So I work at Fordham University. I often look at the Fordham Yik Yak. It's been accused of being used for bullying a lot. So Yik Yak has tried to put all these like really interesting technical affordances to police user behavior. Like, you're not supposed to mention other people by name, and they geofence off the boundary. So like, my apartment is close to a secondary school, so I can't use Yik Yak within my apartment because it thinks I'm a high school student. All right, whatever. I think anonymous internet communication is interesting. I think that it affords some very positive things. Quite frequently, there's evidence that people find it easier to share with other people when they're not having their information tied back to a singular identity, tied to like their marketing profile. And I think it is important for people to have places to express things that they can't express in other places. On the other hand, I think it's also a place where people can express things that are very offensive or problematic or might really hurt somebody else. And the thing about Yik Yak is they'll give personal data over to law enforcement without even thinking about it. Like, that's one of their things, that if you say Yik Yak, like, oh, I want to bomb the school, that they'll give that over to the cops, and the cops will arrest that person, and that's happened several times. I think it's, I go back and forth. I think that I don't believe that technology is neutral at all. I believe that technology can and does sort of express its own politics and values. And the people behind Yik Yak seemed like their ideal was to create something for like self-expression. I don't know. What's your opinion of Yik Yak? I would be curious.
I don't have Yik Yak.
You don't have Yik Yak?
I deleted it a while ago.
Does it have influence on your campus?
Yes, but not like I try not to see it. I'm like,
Yeah, but I do know that there's been a lot of other similar anonymous campus-based things in the past. Like, there used to be something called Juicy Campus, which was like a gossip. People like to gossip. College students love to gossip. Like, people like to gossip, right? Like, people are going to use social media sites to gossip. I'm not sure whether I would say that the negative effects of anonymity outweigh the positive effects, but I think it is important for people to have anonymous spaces online.
As a researcher, I think it's also important. People are always performative. They're putting on a persona on Facebook. They're putting on one right now as we talk to each other. We're doing a persona. And it's interesting to me to be able to see some of these people who are often fairly nasty on Yik Yak, but the chance to actually see what they're saying in a way that they will not show me as an authority figure from the establishment, to know what's going on. So I don't find much of the discussion very pleasant, but I guess I do like to know what people are talking about. And in the end, that, I think, is an important facet, quite apart from the separate question of is it beneficial or harmful, which is not so obvious.
No.
Yeah. Since we have 4 more questions, let's go move on.
So I'm writing a history of the Equal Rights Amendment in graphic novel form, which ends up being really look at the citizenship of women and men and the history of it in this country. And one of the things you notice in the early on is that there's a very deliberate attempt to create spheres. The women will operate in the domestic sphere and the men will operate in the public sphere. And so it's interesting to look at how the, men talk publicly about politics and about sports, and you often find, of course, that they talk about them similarly. They're the teams. And I've noticed as a woman who talks publicly about politics, I get policed by men, and I also get women who write to me and say, "Oh my God, thank you for saying that publicly." And then I get little secret messages, and I have lots of little background forums of women reassuring each other. And a friend of mine, a man, wrote a piece supporting Hillary Clinton, which went kind of viral. And he said he got lots of messages from women saying, "Thank God I had this to share. I was afraid to say I supported Hillary Clinton because I didn't want to get yelled at, but I could share this and be like, look, this guy likes her." So I'm interested in, so it's funny to compare the women talking about shopping publicly and then the harassment that women get for talking publicly. How much of that is about, are women talking in the background that we don't know about? How much of that is affecting each other and what they talk about? I guess would be my...
Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I think the different platforms are very different. So you're communicating with your friends over Facebook is very different from publishing in a blog, and very different from being in a gaming community, which are notoriously competitive would be a polite way to put it. So I think that there are many, many different communities, and each person participates in them in different ways, and it's very hard to generalize across them.
One of the things that we found in our research with young people is that young people will often they'll use like a multiplexity of different apps to communicate. And they'll often have one of those apps will act as a sort of safety valve, which is where they feel that they can be more honest. And so sometimes, and quite often that's because either they're using a pseudonym on a site like Tumblr, or they're communicating with a smaller group of people. Like they have a group text on WhatsApp or something, and that's where they share their more intimate feelings. But the thing about that is, then you're not participating in, quote unquote, what we would think of as the public sphere. Right. And what we see historically in the history of the internet is that men's speech has tended to be more in the public sphere, that the blogs written by men were valued more than the online journals written by women. And when people are talking about who's participating in the kind of like online punditry that we see on sites like Medium, oftentimes it's men who are going into those spaces. So I think that there is certainly a value placed on where people are participating and talking about things. And I do think that the fact that there is this sort of systematic discouragement of women speaking in these sort of internet public spheres, I think that's a very significant problem. I really do. I think it's a devaluing of women's contributions to the political sphere, to the public sphere, and frankly, I think it's a problem with democracy.
So since we've got, two more questions. I thought you could ask them successively, and then we'll have one or two comments.
Hello, my name is Caitlin Hannigan. I'm a strategic communication major at Bridgewater State University, my first senior year. So Alice, I actually connected with a lot of the stuff that you were talking about because we talk a lot about that in my classes. And my question's more geared towards you, but anyone is welcome to answer if they have an opinion. But I don't know if you guys remember, but last spring, Kurt Schilling tweeted something out about his daughter being accepted into a college on a scholarship for softball. And immediately responding, people were sending her death threats. I'm going to rape her. I'm going to do this. We're going to find her, all of that stuff. So my question is pretty much, I know you've done research on like age and like gender and stuff, but I don't know if there's like a difference with celebrities versus like normal people, I guess. It's not like normal people, but like, you kind of get what I'm saying. Yeah. Just because like we talk about like that all the time, but like we talked earlier about kind of like how we act differently in front of different audiences, and celebrities do act like differently probably towards in the media than they do at their homes or with their families or something. So I was wondering about that.
Okay, so we'll come back to that, and let's just hear the last question.
Hi, thanks first. My name is Oren Sur, and I'm doing natural language processing and big data. And I want to go back to Rebecca's famous quotation of Anderson of big data is the end of theory, and ask for your respective takes on that. Thanks.
So should we, shilling or big or end of theory first? Or does anyone want to pick one of those?
I'm happy to talk about the shilling.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
comment.
you.
Okay.
Someone else.
So I think that first of all, we have a culture of criticizing celebrity women, and many of us may not see that as a very serious problem. Like, who cares if like Kim Kardashian gets her feelings hurt? But I think the problem is that the distinction between who is a celebrity and who is not is changing with the era of the internet. So if everybody who puts their pictures online is now susceptible to the same type of severe gendered criticism that we put on famous women, then it becomes an issue of who is more public than others, right? And if all of us are making ourselves public, and often we're forced to make ourselves public as a condition for young people for employment or for education, then we're all susceptible to that same type of like deeply critical language. And I think that's a problem. The second thing is I think that there's a continuum of celebrity practice by which some people are like internet celebrities or Facebook famous or whatever, and they actively are looking for attention online. That's what my first book was all about, was like attention as a particular type of social currency. And so I think that when we're talking about celebrities, it's actually quite important because celebrity as like a model of a commodified self that uses broadcast media to publicize itself is something that's getting closer to the intrinsic subjectivity of social media than we might like to think.
Thanks. Do you want to tackle end of theory?
Well, the limitation of big data is commercial people to actually go and do something interesting and meaningful and useful with it. I think that's the choke point.
In speaking from the standpoint of psychology, it has for the last 50 years been largely a theory-driven field, but I see in the last few years these big data are pushing to be still mostly theory, but increasingly hypothesis-driven. So the one thing that one can do from these focus groups of 10 million people is go not with a theory, but to say, hey, I want to know what people are saying about trans people or about cell phones. Let me not come in with a theory. Let me first observe empirically what's being talked about, and then tie that back to underlying theory of personality or whichever theory structure you want. So I think the ability to generate hypotheses is unbelievably powerful. It's not just asking a question to confirm or falsify a hypothesis. That's a very different style, one that's taken over in medicine, but is fairly new to large parts of the social sciences.
Great. So that's a good note to end on. The data cannot speak for itself, but I want to thank all these panelists for presenting their research. Thank you.